Thanks for joining us here at SomeFuture for episode 12 of our podcast, which we've titled "The Future is Small and Full of Robots." we are your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey.
Today on Present Futures, we will be talking about two exciting stories. One on the future of space exploration with drone technology, and secondly on the ever-extending arm of AI. On PaleoFutures, we'll be talking about current futurist Ray Kurzweil, and on FizBiz, we will be discussing Nano Robotics. And as always, we will have a prominent futurist as our guest. We hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we will be posting supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle at SomeFuture. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com.
That's some future.
Okay, for my present future, I've coined the term. I'm all into terms right now, man. That's how I started the podcast. So I'm calling this one "Robots in Space."
Space.
Picture this: 100 years from now, a man, after a harrowing journey from Earth, is the first man to land on Mars. He soon realizes that he is not alone, however, and can only turn fast enough to grab the martini from the robot bartender's hand. So he looks out and sees a giant face waiting for him. It's been 100 years, and the face of Mars has been transformed not by the hands of men, but by the claws and hands of drones and robots. So, all joking aside, that's a future that some people at NASA and other futurists actually have in mind. Instead of first sending a manned mission to Mars to live in cramped quarters, instead there's been talk of sending drones and 3D printers to Mars in order to make habitats for man to live in and to change the environment to suit them. And if the pace of technology is exponential, as some people suggest, some NASA scientists believe that self-replicating robots or drones are the key to furthering mankind's reach for the stars.
Self-replicating? So is this 3D printed robots where they can fix their Johnny 5 where he goes and attaches his arm or something like that? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so I bring it up because this is no longer the realm of what we consider science fiction. So recently, scientists at the University of Ottawa in Canada have created a 3D printer that can print out robotic pieces and can even create other 3D printers from local materials that a robot arm scoops up and puts it into the machine. It does this by heating the materials to about 900 degrees Celsius using power only from the sun. So this is exciting news. But it comes as no shock to NASA, whose SwampWorks division has been working on drones for a number of years, which would be able to fly in harsh atmospheres, such as Mars' atmosphere, to perform a variety of tasks, such as collecting samples of materials and doing other forms of labor. The drones are being designed to run autonomously with materials from whatever environment they may be in. So whether it be Mars or the moon, it's got a lot of different applications. So they're calling it the Extreme Access Flyer. It basically will be able to run off the local materials and mine materials needed by astronauts who would have to bring anything they needed to survive with them to Mars. So my question for you, Chris, is what technologies have you heard of that might be created in the near future to aid in colonizing a planet outside of this?
Well, I would say, obviously everything that companies like Boston Dynamics are doing that are trying to understand how a robot can move properly, right? And the speed of it, but also the dexterity of it. 3D printing, to me, that's the most fantastic thing that I've heard in a while when it comes to robotics, is the fact that you can harvest whatever is out, on Mars or perhaps another planet, and then go ahead and create another appendage or whatever the heck you need, and then the robot can then self-assemble. I think that's particularly fantastic. But to me, in the near term, in the acute form, because I think that's kind of far futures, right? In the near futures, I'm extremely interested in the companies that are learning how to deftly move, and I've seen there's everything from bipedal robots, the four-legged robots that look frightening. When you see them running around, they're moving 60 miles an hour, or the spider ones. I'm interested in those companies because the terrain of Mars is very rocky. I think we need to move past just the wheeled base because it allows to explore. And also, we have to think about the folks that are behind the prosthetics movement, the neo prosthetics that we're using that can, actually are connected to the human brain. I think those sorts of folks need to be embedding themselves in this particular extraterrestrial exploration robotics program, because sometimes those folks don't merge, and I think that's why prosthetics have really taken off really well, is that the folks that have been exploring the neo prosthetics movement and have been at the forefront, they've really understood the human body, and they really understood things from picking up things to moving your arm and having it be as physically, having the same resemblance as a human being. So we need those same folks to understand what are the movements in order to dig, what are the movements needed to scale a rock and not slip, what are the type of robots that we need to have on the ground to make this happen. And so I'm assuming there will be some sort of taxonomy. We need to have wheeled, we need to have bipedal, we need to have multi-legged, we need to have some that can print their own devices. What type of metallurgy do we need? So I think there's a lot of, I guess, questions to be answered, and I'm assuming NASA is doing a lot of it. And I've looked at what you've forwarded, and I'm looking at others as well. But to me, that's where I think the work needs to go into. Yes, the 3D printing, that's particularly cool, but we just need to ensure that once we place it there on Mars, you saw how difficult it was to plant the initial Mars rovers. They had that balloon, and it was specifically formulated, and it bounced, and then it was able to be put there. That's particularly novel. But these are just the wheeled robots, right, with an arm, and that is dramatically different than the Boston Dynamics horse thing that runs 65 miles an hour, or like can run up hills and stuff like that. So, and that is only based in the backyard of some Cambridge laboratory somewhere. What happens when you put it millions of miles away from Earth, and how to control it and whatnot? So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm interested to see how that work is being implemented. Okay, great. So for my present futures today, I'll be taking a look at it's a PDF. It's a paper about artificial intelligence, and I think we've been talking about artificial intelligence since we started this podcast. A little bit of personal thing in here. I'm actually now a part of the strategy for artificial intelligence for the company that I work for. So this has really been on top of mine. I've been thinking about it a whole heck of a lot, and it just so happened that a paper came out today by some Yale and Oxford University graduate students, where they did a survey, and it was all about when will AI exceed human performance, and what are the evidence from AI experts. Now, this paper is not particularly robust, but what I really wanted to do was just kind of open up a dialogue with you, Jack, to kind of talk about, what are your thoughts in terms of AI, and we can kind of go in a lot of different ways. But let's just kind of go through the gist of the paper before we kind of talk a little bit about AI. But so essentially, they're saying the same thing that anybody's talking when it comes to AI currently, right? That advances in artificial intelligence are going to completely transform modern life. They're going to reshape transportation, health, science, finance, the military. It's going to shape public policy. And there are a lot of people, this is top of mind. This is extremely important. So these folks, these graduate students, there's looks like there's 5 of them. They did a pretty thorough analysis where they did an outreach to over 1,000 different AI researchers. 325 of them came back, and they were able to sort of put together some data points. Right, they're mostly the questions were trying to figure out when AI was going to officially take over. Right, and so how they frame this is high level machine intelligence, so HLMI. Right, and so this is an achievement when unaided machines can accomplish every task better and more cheaper than human workers. And essentially, the aggregate of all this information, the results, what they saw was at least 4 four distinct findings from all of their research. One, all the researchers around the world felt and believed that that machine learning has accelerated in recent years. Two, the explosive progress of AI after HLMI, high-level machine intelligence, is seen as completely possible, but possibly improbable. Three, HLMI is likely seen to have a positive outcome, but it could have catastrophic risk. And the fourth is that society should prioritize research aiming at minimizing those risks. So, none of this is particularly novel. This is stuff that we've been hearing, but it is particularly helpful to see that there's people who are doing surveys to kind of break this down and completely understand this. Now, in this report, there's some really interesting figures that they have in it. A couple, what they did essentially is these 325 AI researchers that they were able to grab, they put forward these questions, and then they're able to take a look at the milestones in which an AI will go ahead and take over that job. So they did this. It's everything from beating angry birds, which could be done probably within the next 3 years, to writing a high school essay. They think that could be done within 10 years. And they even did some longer forecast where a retail salesperson, they're thinking AI can take that over in about 15, and a math researcher possibly in as many as 50 years. So, a lot of this is sort of stuff that you and I, we talk about it a lot, but I just wanted to, get your ideas sort of around this. Again, not anything particularly novel. What I thought was particularly interesting about this was that the different jobs that can be sort of taken over and when. And there was actually another interesting thing where they noticed a distinct difference between the Asian populace of the AI researchers they reached out to versus the United States and European. The Asian AI researchers all said and expected the HLMI to take over quicker. So they thought that this would happen in 44 years versus 74 years in North America. So I thought that was particularly, novel thing as well. So I don't know, Jack. I mean, this may be more of the same, but I think it's great to see some hard numbers from the aggregate of all these different AI researchers that are out there.
Absolutely, man. I mean, I think that, again, you have to put your guesstimate out there of when this will happen, but it looks like everybody is still agreeing that it is going to happen. And that's, I guess, the first step is you have to realize, hey, this is going to happen. What are we going to do to fix it? I do find it funny that the Asian researchers thought that it would happen quicker, but I think that they're more, as opposed to us, so at least the Japanese, for example, they tend to be a little bit more technologically focused than we are. So I could see them saying, hey, we see that happening because we put so much effort towards technology.
Sure. Well, it could be that. But, what was interesting is when we spoke to, or at least when I spoke to Sohail, it was such a bummer that you were unable to speak to him. That guy's such a rich idea about future studies. But one thing that he thought, because I asked him, hey, what's the difference between doing Asian futures versus sort of North American or West futures, right, to include the EU. And he said that Asia, because they're kind of going through their technological and managerial and economic revolutions currently right now, right, that's happening in China and India and some of the other developing Asian tigers, that they're skipping all the inaction of governments. They're going straight to AI, or they're going straight to blockchain, or they're going straight to XYZ technology. And so I think they have, in some ways, they may even have a more positive view of themselves in not only in government, but also in society and economics and technology, because maybe they can learn from the West. And so I in some ways, I think after speaking with Sohail, this 44 versus 74 years is spot on, at least from speaking to him. Because it seems like Asia, can skip these, sort of parameters. It may even say also something of the pessimistic attitude of the EU and North America. And I don't know if that's current political climate or if this is just the overall view of what people feel when it comes to AI researchers, that this is going to take a little bit longer than shorter, like Asia. But I mean, who's to say? I mean, there's smart people everywhere, sort of covering the space.
Well, I think that you bring up an interesting point that I was actually going to talk about in one of our future podcasts is government structures. So when you have like a communist government like China, where the government is doing everything, and you don't have the same political climate that you have in the Western nations, where right now, like in the United States, we have a lot, and we've had it for a number of decades now, almost a standstill. It takes forever to get anything done. There is no such thing as a bipartisan support. We are being dragged down by our belief system and by our government system. Not to advocate for one thing or another, or say one thing's good or nothing's bad, but it does in a way tend to tamper progress. And we've talked about this with CRISPR and things like that. Like the Chinese are already working with it. China is, they're like, they don't have any hangups about using, CRISPR to change the human, genome or anything like that. There, while in the United States, there's people who may be religious, who have a disagreement with the fact that, that's changing what God intended. And, I think that's, maybe that's the point, is that, maybe the Asian nations, they'll see it first because they're the ones who are willing to do almost anything, whether that's good or bad, to see it happen.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really a crucial element, right, of this, that I think escapes a lot of the news that you see. Ever since I've sort of not taken on strategy completely of AI, but sort of taken a hardened look at it in the last couple of weeks and last couple of months. One thing I notice is that there's a new AI story every day, and a lot of it is centered on the technology, the economics behind it. But what we forget is the human aspects. We're talking about the political aspects. We're talking about the legal, the regulatory frameworks, whether people will even use it, right? So I could definitely see, to me, that's one of the stories here, right? It's not just the fact, yes, it's changing society, it's wonderful, it's going to impact us all the way, but, oh, hey, by the way, what sort of framework are we going to put around AI? How are we going to institute it? Is it going to be global? Is there going to be a regulatory framework that's only in the EU? Is the UK going to have one that's different than France versus the United States versus China? How will it all coalesce? And very soon we're seeing that the cyber attacks are being put up. We see the cyber attacks that are happening in the American electoral systems, also global systems that are happening allegedly from Russia. So this is moving beyond that. When we have artificial intelligence that is able to create efficiencies in government, in everything from energy to finance and how we pay our citizens to healthcare systems, that means that we're all completely interconnected. And as they are saying, lots of positive outcomes, but also completely catastrophic risk. And so, go ahead.
Let me stop you there for a second,
Sure.
Because I want to talk about those videos that you sent me as well. And I think that, definitely put those in the show notes, because I think that they took almost a darker look at what AI will do to us as a society. And so, Mike, I have a question for you: is where do you see AI taking us? Do you see a dark future or something a little bit more bright?
I mean, I'm always the positive guy, I think, on this show, and I'm still somewhat positive on it. But I am definitely in the Elon Musk / Stephen Hawking camp, right? And Sam Harris too. I mean, and I'm glad that these folks. They're not contrarians, right? They're not Luddites. They're not saying, let's go ahead and forget about this technology, or let's slow walk it, right? Completely. I think they're saying, look, this technology has a way to completely interconnect humanity in ways that we've never had, right? We're currently in the social network interconnection. We could see that just through social interaction, what type of power that has, not only on our electorate, but on the feelings of the country, the overall, how countries feel, how they interact with each other, how they interact with other countries in the world. And so this is very novel. It's very new, right? And so the same thing is going to happen when it comes to AI, and it's being embedded into whether it's a pharmaceutical system, whether it is a healthcare system, finance, economics. It is going to be a part of all these different systems. And so these folks that are saying, hey, slow down, let's create a framework around this, let's talk about this first and see what, yes, many positive outcomes, many technological breakthroughs. I think it's really going to be it's going to have a positive effect on the world at large. However, because we have so much interconnection, that means there's a lot of negative aspects and catastrophic things that could actually cause a collapse of systems that may even outweigh some of the positive effects. So yes, I believe the positive is going to outweigh the negative, but I believe, just like Elon and Sam and Steven are saying, hey, look, let's ensure that we create systems, protocols, we do thought experiments, we do scenario exercises. We're able to completely understand how AI actually can impact us negatively, and then create systems to ensure that those negative impacts don't overtake all the positives. Okay, great. So for PaleoFutures today, I'm cheating a little bit just because PaleoFutures is sometimes, or actually, well, all the time, we choose a futurist or we choose a story or a movie or something that came out a little bit a while ago. And Ray Kurzweil he is not dead.
No, he's
still
not.
he's still alive, and he's still a futurist. He's currently working for Google. But I think I wanted to bring him up just because he's made a lot of really interesting predictions. And oh, by the way, this seems to be a common theme when it comes to our PaleoFutures, is that a lot of these predictions have come true. So let's just talk a little bit about Ray Kurzweil for folks who don't know him. To me, I think if you're going to talk about a futurist, you're going to talk about Ray Kurzweil for sure. He's one of these guys. He's an author. He's a computer scientist. He's an inventor. He's been involved in fields such as optical character recognition, text-to-speech synthesis. He invented a keyboard that Stevie Wonder could play, and he's written books on health and artificial intelligence, transhumanism, technological singularity, something that he helped popularize and coin. He's been an advocate for futurism, the transhumanist movement, and he actually has a really great website too called KurzweilAI.net, which is an exceptional website to go to for futures news. I'm a big fan of him. But as I was alluding to, he has made a lot of predictions in his lifetime, and he even did a breakdown of all the predictions that he did in a book. So he wrote a book called the Age of Intelligent Machines, where he forecast. This was published in 1990. He forecast the demise of the Soviet Union. The new technology was going to, such as cell phones and fax machines, was going to make it to where they can't control information. So it would remove the state control. So he predicted that the Soviet Union would falter, which it did. He also extrapolated that the coming computer technology would allow for a supercomputer to defeat the best chess masters, one in which IBM's Deep Blue did. He spoke on the crazy implications of internet technology and how that was going to completely change all of humanity, which obviously it did. And he's just said a lot of cool stuff. He's the late 20th century. He said that there would be a voice activated typewriter that would come by 1995. He was a little early, but everybody recognizes Siri there. He talked about translating telephones that could allow people to speak in different languages. Oh, by the way, I just saw this as a scan. I could put that in the show notes. I don't know if you saw, but IBM is working with a hardware company where you can put the headphones on and you can actually hear translated in 8 languages, and Spanish and French and I think Italian are some of those languages. So I'm really looking forward to going back to Europe, that stuff. And, he just has a lot of just really cool predictions too that really aren't going to come here. So his predictions for 2020 include phone calls with 3-dimensional holographic images for you Star Wars fans out there, and Princess Leia. By 2020 says there's going to be a new world government. And of course, his one of his most famous predictions is the one of the technological singularity, where the idea about it is that humanity is going to be so interconnected with technology that we'll not know where our humanity ends and where the technology is, and we'll become in some ways more technology than we are humans. So he's always been on the forefront. He's been writing about this stuff for a really long time. And, I thought he would be a perfect person to throw into PaleoFutures.
Yeah, man, he's pretty neat. I mean, I agree with you that he's not dead, but I mean, I mean, you're right. You mentioned some of what what he was able to predict. Some of it hasn't always been correct. He's not 100% right. He's talked about the future of the internet being that big disruptor that you're talking about, like, basically essentially causing the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think we need to talk about like what he does now. I mean, he's still an inventor. He works for Google as like he's like their futurist that they have. They actually pay him to be their futurist and basically predict things so that they can create technologies based off of that. He's still winning awards. I think he's been awarded like 26 honorary doctorates, something ridiculous. I mean, he's just an all around cool guy. I mean, he's got all of these ideas. And here's the thing: is even though you and I talk about futurism and we make predictions in our podcast, we realize that not all of them are going to be correct. He states the same as well. It's like he throws these predictions out there and he wants people to make them correct. He's an inventor, I think, first and foremost. I mean, if you know anything about his history, he was one of the first. I'd say he was probably the only kid in like the 1960s when he was growing up that was using a computer, that had access to a computer. He grew up in New York City, and he was there. And when he was first working on computers, there were only 14 in the entire city of New York. So to imagine a child, I think he was between the ages like 6 and 12, and was working with these computers. That's pretty neat. I think that he's a really cool guy. I think that he's only 69. He's got several more years left in him. I think it's cool. He's talked about, and so in 2008 he actually said that in the next 20 years solar power will generate enough energy to meet all of the Earth's power requirements. If someone could throw out something that specific, you got to know he's got his hand in it somewhere. I've read The Singularity is Near. I think he's got. I mean, I would highly recommend it, even if you aren't a futurist and you just like learning about technology and where you think it's going to go. I think that's a really cool book to read. I think that he's got, he wrote a book recently, and I say recently because in the past couple of years, where he basically talked about all of his predictions, because he's written like these 3 big books with all of his predictions on them. And I think that book that he wrote in the end, he basically said, look, these are some of the things I got right. These are some things I got wrong. I think, if you can follow him on like LinkedIn, he puts things out. It's a really cool thing to just to listen to what he has to say and come up with your own thoughts based off of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great to talk about those previous predictions. There's a infographic where we can actually talk about his fantastic predictions for the future now. So, right, 2017. So, here's just some of them, right? So, and some of them, by the way, are already coming true. He's saying creative AI by 2019 is now capable of making complex art and music. By the way, that's happening right now. AI is creating music as we speak. Autonomous vehicles are now going to dominate the roads by 2019. I think, maybe not dominate, but autonomous vehicles are on the roads right now. In 2 years, who's to know how many will be additionally on there. By the 2030s, this is when he's actually talking about the neural net that is the synthetic neocortexes that we're going to be connecting ourselves to. That's particularly interesting. He's a big fan of brain nanorobots and their ability to elicit emotional responses in users. So this will all happen by the 2030s. The singularity, of course, is happening in 2045. He supposes that by 2045, AI will surpass human beings as the smartest and most capable life forms on the planet. By 2049, artificial food is commonly assembled by nanomachines. So I know we were talking about the future of food, of course, with Alicia. And by 2099, so within by the end of the century, the computer viruses are their major threat because we're all interconnected to this Borg machine. So computer viruses are just as important of wiping out humanity as regular viruses. Artificial intelligence can create powerful planet-sized computers that will be, embedded all over the universe. And he's even saying that there's some humans that may be as old as the baby boomers that will still be alive due to these new burgeoning, healthcare technologies that we have coming on. So, I think as long as he's alive, he's gonna still be putting out these predictions. And like you said, I think what it does to the folks like Google and folks like me and you is it gives us hope, right? And it gives us something to pursue, and it gives us that moonshot that JFK did, right? Where, hey, we're gonna land on the moon. Well, hey, maybe we can get baby boomers to live until the end of the century. Maybe we can get nano robots in our brains to help us better understand our issues that we have when it comes to depression or schizophrenia or something like that. So these are wild predictions and that are steeped and based, I think, in technology, because he's so connected to how technology embeds itself in all of humanity. But they're not completely so fantastical that we can't take them to heart and can't put them into motion and make them something tangible and real. I think that's the real positive aspects of having a guy like Ray Kurzweil in the world, and I'm glad that he exists.
Okay, we are now going to start our FizBiz segment. Chris, I was waiting for the FizBiz, man.
Oh, FizBiz. Sorry.
Okay, so we're starting our FizBiz segment, always with our disclaimer at first, saying that these investment decisions are solely our own or solely based off of our beliefs. We're not responsible for anything that may happen to you if you invest it in one way or another. You're responsible for your own investment decisions. All right, moving on. So we talk a lot about medicine on this show and like the future of medicine in general. However, we have yet to bring up the importance of nanorobotics and the life-changing aspects that it could bring to the field. It's interesting that we talked about Ray Kurzweil in our PaleoFutures segment, because he actually had a lot to talk about when he was talking about nanorobots. He basically said that nanotechnology has the potential to solve serious world issues such as death and all of these things that it basically could be like almost a panacea of cure-alls for so many different types of things that are wrong with our society, or that we just haven't come up with solutions yet for. So on today's show, we've discussed drones, robots, artificial intelligence, and currently there's actually a race that's being conducted by companies to be the first ones to produce a certain type of all of those types of machines. And it's important to note that these machines could have life-altering consequences for not only manufacturing purposes, but for a new field that is expected to grow to $392 billion by 2023 and over $1 trillion in the next few years after that. So the field of nanorobotics is undergoing a de facto arms race as companies like General Electric, HP, Synopsys, Siemens, Northrop Grumman are all working on researching and developing nanorobotics. While these companies are focusing on what nanorobotics could do in the realms of manufacturing, I'm actually going to narrow our focus down and talk about nanomedicine and the potential to be part of an industry that has what I consider nearly limitless potential. While I'm not going to go into a whole history and evolution of the field of nanorobotics, maybe I'll do that later, I do feel that it is important to tell our listeners what nanomedicine is and really harp on the potential that it has. Nanomedicine is the medical application of nanotechnology, which in itself is anything that is artificial in nature and is smaller than 10 to the negative ninth power of a meter in diameter. So the field of nanomedicine itself ranges from medical applications such as nanomaterials and biological devices to nanoelectric biosensors to eventually molecular nanotechnology such as biological machines. It's currently being applied through the use of nanotechnology-based drugs in which nanoparticles have been created by companies of today, which can help target cancer cells. They can prolong the life of some drugs. They can deliver antibodies and other medicines to patients with advanced forms of cancer. It's being used in imaging, which can highlight cancer cells once ingested or can track movement of where drugs go throughout the body. Other applications include tissue engineering, blood purification, and more. Still, we're only scratching the surface of what nanomedicine is capable of. Going back to Ray Kurzweil, he actually discussed in PaleoFutures Today, he stated in his book, The Singularity is Near, where he stated that advanced nanorobotics could completely remedy the effects of aging by 2030. So just bringing you in on this, Chris, I mean, what do you know about nanomedicine? I mean, what are some interesting ways you think this technology could be applied?
Well, I mean, we were talking a little bit about it when it came to our Ray Kurzweil discussion about nanorobotics in the human brain and its ability to possibly deliver signals or chemicals to allow for better processing and the elimination of certain mental illnesses. But we're talking nanorobots have the ability to do things in the bloodstream, the ability to help with the processes. The human body is really just a selection, or excuse me, a series of interconnected systems. And so nanorobotics have the ability to affect those systems very similar to the way that robotics create efficiencies on a factory floor. So, I think it's just a matter of the creative will of scientists to figure out ways to create nanorobots to do very specific things inside the human body. And I'm interested to see, what those things are. There's a lot of ailments to the human body. In fact, it's infinite and numerous. And my guess is along with genome mapping and understanding how the human body works at the genetic and systems level holistically, nanorobots are going to be a part of that solution making for many years to come.
Sure. I mean, you hit the nail on the head again, right there. It's basically, so one thing that I'm going to get into is I'm actually not going to give people a company that they should invest. Instead, I'm going to give people a plethora of companies that they should look into because of all the different applications that nanorobotics and then nanomedicine have. Since it's FizBiz, there's 3 companies that are currently building nanorobotics factories. These are companies I think that I should recommend that everyone should look into because a nanorobotics factory is a factory which can be nano-sized in itself that is capable of producing either nanorobots that can self-replicate or nanorobots or nanoparticles that can be ingested into the system that ultimately may be responsible for combating all of the diseases, bacterias, and even aging like Mr. Kurzweil mentioned in his book. So these companies are Zymergen, it's spelled Zymergen, Ginkgo Bioworks, and Synthase, Synthace. Those are companies that I would highly recommend people getting into. And you'll notice, though, that there are several traditional names that are attached to those companies. Either all these companies they're interbreeding with each other. They have, all these big names have their hands in all of these pots, just in case one thing, one technology is greater than the other. So there are actually several companies that are leading in the nanomedicine market, and those include familiar names like Merck, Hoffman La Roche, Gilead Sciences, Novartis, Amgen, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Nanobiotics, Sanofi, and a couple others. So I would say take a particular look at Merck and Pfizer. These are 2 powerhouses that are, I think, great long-term investments, even if they didn't have these attachments, they were building these nanorobotics. Because I think these are very innovative companies. I think that they'll develop these technologies and will basically be responsible for a huge generation of wealth. Now, I would caution because, obviously if government gets involved and especially when it comes to human lives, you can't really put a price tag on living for forever. So, I think these companies will be able to charge whatever they want unless they're regulated because, they can charge an arm and leg because they will be saving people's lives and extending them for who knows how long. Also, another company I think is AstraZeneca because they hold shares in companies like, what I was saying, they have, all these big companies have their hands in a lot of different pots. So there's a company called Bind Therapeutics, which is currently a privately held company. But here's the thing, you can invest in the publicly held companies that have their hands in these privately held ones. So Bind Therapeutics developed a product called Acuren, which is a targeted and programmable cancer nanomedicine based on a molecularly targeted kinase inhibitor developed and owned by AstraZeneca. So I think those are really cool companies to look into. But how do you pick a company that will do well? I would suggest to continue following the work of the MIT scientists, because just as all of those companies have their hands in each other, in the private companies, the public companies have their hands in the private companies. A lot of these companies are working with MIT scientists, and since the MIT is an institution of learning, a lot of these MIT scientists are publishing papers, and they're publishing on the future of nanomedicine. I would wait to see, who's developing this magic pill, and I'm putting that again in quotations, because, to see what will be the panacea to many of these types of ailments. Because if they can develop a nanorobot that could, eventually you could ingest and, takes care of our body from the inside, can you imagine what that could do for, society, or, the, healthfulness of humankind? Imagine that it's, disposable, it leaves our skin through natural means, we may be able to have to replace it, or it could be self-replicating from the things that we ingest or, produce in our bodies. I think that, there's a lot of things that this could turn into. And Ray Kurzweil was one of the many futurists who cover this topic because it has so much potential. And it's interesting that I know that I'm covering it on FizBiz, but I'm saying that because I think that it has the potential to not only generate a lot of healthfulness in the humankind, but a lot of wealth as well. I mean, what do you see this technology turning into, Chris?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's a big market for this, right? And this is particularly helpful, I think, to the novices, the people that are listening to this podcast and don't completely understand future studies. Future studies is not in the pages of the New York Times. Sometimes it is, but for the most part, it's not. It's not in USA Today. It's not in Parade Magazine. You're going to find future studies in places like science fiction. You're going to find it in trade journals. You're going to find it in a science experiment that happened, that a couple of folks in UC Berkeley or in China or Germany in a lab did once. And they thought, wow, this is particularly novel, and this could potentially help humanity. So you're absolutely right? Like nano robotics it's not even on the cutting edge. I think you'd put blockchain and you'd put self-driving cars. That's the cutting edge. Nano robotics is in its infancy of us trying to figure out what we're going to do. So all the more reason why we should have eyes and ears on it and completely understand, its positive and negative ramifications, and also the potential market sizing for it, right? Because right now we could say, okay, we know what the size of the autonomous vehicle market may be, right? We can see we could extrapolate it, but something like nano robotics is going to be a little bit harder. So what that means is that folks who have a big interest in its possible investments, you need to pay attention to the companies, as you were just noting, who are connecting with these avant-garde researchers, who are completely understanding the technology, can speak on it and give voice to it, and also extrapolate themselves on where they see this technology going. So, this is, to me, there's certain technologies that are very futuristic heavy, right? And a guy who works at Wired, to me, is not particularly a futurist, right? Because he is paying very close attention to the current trends. Someone who's interested in future studies, looking very far away, this is a perfect example of why futurists hold a particularly captivating place in the modern, whatever it's, academia or media landscape, whatever you want to call it, because they're looking at these very specific, unique technologies that no one's talking about or really haven't been fleshed out at all. So if you're interested in investing in this stuff, do exactly what Jack is saying. Take a hard look at these companies. Start taking a look at the trade journals. Start exploring what these experiments in nanotechnology will be and nanorobotics will be. Start understanding the language, the terminology, the groups, the organizations, the universities, the countries that are leading with these technologies. And you may be there before anybody gets there. So similar to what happened with autonomous cars, similar to what's happening currently when artificial intelligence, where that landscape is being drawn out and you can start to see that there's certain people that are leading in it. We don't know that just yet with nanorobotics. And so the closer you are towards the beating heart of what nanotechnology is, the quicker you will be, and possibly the more positive your gains will be when it comes to investing in this new and exciting technology. All right, great. For the interview segment of the SomeFuture podcast today, we have Morgan Kaufman. Morgan Kaufman is a self-described information sponge. He's a problem solver. He's a futurist. He's a systems thinker in both heritage and training. He's got a BS in geology and a master's in strategic foresight both from the University of Houston. He's worked as a researcher for the Austin-based geopolitical intelligence platform Stratfor, as well as a forecaster for the Good Judgment Project. More recently, he's been working as a self-employed consultant, writing a book. Is it called The Interlock? Or you're still putting that together? Is that what
it's currently currently rethinking America, getting serious about poverty, the economy, and inequality.
Geez, so a gigantic book on domestic policy. Good luck with that. Yep. So, he's been writing this, building the skills and experience around strategic forecast and systems thinking, research analysis, and putting this all together. Morgan, thanks a lot for coming and joining the SomeFuture podcast. It's
a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, man. So, you're an interesting guy to bring on this podcast because yes, you have worked in the futures field for a while, but more specifically, you bring a systems thinking approach to futures, which is very interesting because I don't think a lot of our audience even knows what systems thinking is. So, Morgan, can you just kind of give us a quick overview of what systems thinking is and how it might be helpful to future studies?
Systems is about looking at how things are interconnected with each other. One of the ways that I like to think of it is thinking about the difference between a grandfather clock and an ecosystem. Grandfather clock is complicated. It's got a lot of moving pieces, but they all move in the exact same pattern every time, every tick of the clock. The ecosystem, though, has a lot of moving pieces, but they can change depending on what happens inside the ecosystem. You take away too many predators and the prey population explodes, then dies off because they eat their food too much. And that's a complex system. A lot of moving parts, a lot of interconnections between those parts, and you push down on the scales one place and the ripple effects can have incredibly diverse consequences throughout the system. So systems thinking is a way of looking at that kind of complexity and being able to both model and predict how it's going to change and describe that to other people.
And we're looking at these models through this sort of system of interconnected arrows and circles and whatnot. I mean, I know it's probably hard for us to describe, but can you sort of describe what the systems thinking process is and how you go about it?
First, you research the crap out of. Sorry, am I allowed to curse?
You can. You can say crap. It's all right. It's not a problem.
You research the heck out of something, and you basically try to describe in a visual format how the pieces of it are connected to each other. Basically, by figuring out the important parts of it. So, in that ecosystem example, you would have deer and wolves. This is the most basic example with just predator and prey. And so you have a bubble called deer and a bubble called wolves, and you have arrows linking back and forth between them. And then you can expand upon that and increase the complexity as needed.
And these bases are they're like archetypes, right? Like, so there's different types of systems thinking models that have been worked, because I'm assuming there's a big historical view of systems, right?
Yeah.
It goes back to, I think, MIT or something.
It goes back to the 1950s or 60s when people were trying to figure out how to get self-guiding weapon systems up and running, self-modulating automation, and sort of grew from that kind of cybernetic approach into this kind of view of a mechanical and electronic system actually applies to biologic or economic or social systems. And so economists, social scientists kind of grabbed it and ran with it.
Sure.
And yeah, so it's got a long history.
And then, so now we're using systems thinking, I'm assuming, just for about anything. I remember when I was doing my future studies program, one of the things that Andy Hines, told me was he starts every problem with systems, right? And so you can take a look at, or anything, right, with systems, whether it's the U.S. election, whether it is the Israeli Arab issue, whether it's a war, let's say the Afghani war, which I think is a prime example. So I'm just kind of talking a little bit about what those examples are. Are there any examples that you can speak on that you've seen or that we can point to our audience to kind of give them a feel for, what systems thinking, is all about?
There is a organization called Democracy Fund, which has just recently not just dipped their toe, but kind of jumped in whole hog to using systems as a way of modeling some of their priorities. And they're interested in election fairness, election mechanics, and they've started building models, just simple, quote unquote, causal loop diagrams of the election cycle and the way that the American election system sort of throws representative democracy off kilter. So democracyfund.org, www.democracyfund.org, and click on our approach, and that'll get you their idea of how systems works. This is an organization that is not native to systems. They just found it and just ran with it.
That's super awesome. And so essentially this is a technique that really anyone, even if you're not a futurist, you could use. So you can maybe use this for yourself, your personal self. Maybe you're trying to figure out why you're always broke at the end of the month, or maybe you're trying to figure out, why you're so slow to get up in the morning, or you can never take the time to paint and put up those darn cabinets like you're supposed to. Maybe I'm getting a little personal here, but but ultimately, this systems thinking approach, and I want to go back to a term that you actually just used, causal loop. Mm-hmm. So, I think you were alluding to, right, you're like, for instance, in your deer and wolf population, that we were going to go connect these with arrows. So, and essentially what that is it's called a causal loop diagram, right? And so I'm assuming when it comes to these loops, and at least what I've learned about systems thinking is that there are positive feedback loops and there are negative feedback loops. Can you talk a little bit about how these work within the systems thinking kind of? If you're going to create something, let's go. If maybe keep it simple. Let's go back to that simple deer wolf example. How do these positive and negative negative arrows work, and then maybe we can expand it out to kind of include other things which make that example a little bit more complicated.
All right. So first off, a note on vocabulary. We use positive and negative feedback because that's the original way it was described. Positive feedback, both of them got co-opted by the education movement as describing, how to talk to children. Positive feedback, negative feedback, and that can confuse people. So what we like to say in modern times is reinforcing and balancing feedback loops, but those of us who learned it in the old school approach still slip into it. So if I mix terms, that's what I'm talking about. Positive feedback is a reinforcing cycle. When if you have, let's go simple, go with rabbits. You have 2 rabbits, and in a couple months, you're going to have 8 rabbits. In another couple months, you're going to have 16, and eventually 64, and it keeps growing. The population keeps doubling or quadrupling or whatever every set amount of time period, and that's a reinforcing loop. That's a positive feedback loop. The more rabbits you have, the more rabbits you have in the next time period. Whereas a negative feedback loop or a balancing loop is something that reduces the growth of something or reduces the drop of something. So for the deer and wolf populations, that's the wolf population acting as a brake on the deer population's growth. So the more deer you have, and they keep growing exponentially if they're not checked. But the more deer you have, the more food there is for the wolves, and so the wolves eat the deer, reducing the population. and thus acting as a brake on the deer population's growth. If you have the two populations in balance, they may fluctuate slightly, but barring disaster, they're going to stay steady essentially forever. Whereas if you suddenly remove the wolves, deer population spikes exponentially, and in a few years you have no deer because the deer ate their food supply down to the root.
So systems thinking is used, at least when we're talking about ecology. I've heard many examples. I think one example is maybe Australia, where they introduced like some non-indigenous animal. I don't think it might be the same rabbit that we're talking about. And then there was like there was an overrun of rabbits because there was no predators there. So then they introduced a predator, and then there was an overrun of the predators. And matter of fact, we see this happen a lot where humans intervene in nature, when in reality they could have just grabbed Morgan Kaufman and he could have created a systems diagram to kind of give voice to this. But moving beyond ecology, as we were alluding to, systems thinking works with a lot of stuff. It could work with ecology. It could work with wars. It could work with, I think, the human body. You can one exercise, because the human body is normally in a stasis. It's a set of equilibrium. So I'm assuming that things like when it comes to insulin rates inside the human body, or sweating, that's one exercise we went through, the sweating.
And if you talk with medical people about systems, they're like, but this is basic stuff. This is complicated for people because they deal with it every day.
Right.
So it's definitely applicable to internal biology. I mean, wildfires, getting back to ecology a little bit, but also with human intervention in ecology, we try to keep wildfires from happening, but then they come back, and when they happen, they're enormous. They explode because there's all this dead litter on the ground that would normally have been burned away. So climate change, obviously, extremely complex, lots of feedback loops, so much so that we don't really understand. Even those of us who have studied the subject don't understand all of the fine points. Government, there's a lot of feedback loops in how governments tax people, how governments can fund services, and how that feeds back into the tax base. And there's an enormous variety in economics and governance in social science.
For sure. And I think, that's, again, now we're going to go back to, I think, what your work is. I'm glad you kind of gave us that overview of systems, and we're going to go ahead and put in our show notes so people understand systems for the audience. It's not only difficult to talk about, but it took me at least 3 or 4 months just to get it embedded into myself, and now it's never gone. I think of the world as a system of interconnected relationships between multiple things, and I'm sure you do it too. And speaking on that, I think I want to talk a little bit about your work in terms of your latest research project. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you're doing and how systems thinking and being a futurist, putting your futurist hat on, is helping with your work?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on a book, as we discussed, but that grew out of what was originally just a research project that was based on a systems approach to public policy. It still is, but it's no longer focused entirely on the systems aspect. Originally, it was the Interlock Project, interlockproject.com. You can look at the skeleton of it that's still left behind. And it was basically what happened was I was reading what was going on in 2010, 2011, and just had this insight that we're talking about poverty, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about environmental issues, infrastructure, education, corruption, law enforcement, criminal justice. We're talking about how all of these things are going wrong, but no one's talking about how they're impacting each other. Everybody's aware that they are. I mean, obviously, education impacts poverty. Infrastructure impacts economic growth. Everybody knows this. Everybody talks about specific linkages when it's necessary for their own argument. No one's talking about how they all interconnect, how all of these interconnections are going on at the same time. No one's talking about how we deal with solving these problems by taking those interconnections into account. And so what the Interlock project was an attempt to document those links, which involved researching 12 different knowledge domains.
Sounds really easy.
Yeah, no, the reason that that's turned into a book is because that was too much to bite off and chew. So what the futures aspect of it for me is that you can't. The reason that we involve systems in future studies is, as you say, you have to look at these things. If you're looking 10, 20 years into the future, 30, 40, 50, whatever, you have to think about how those systems are going to regulate themselves, how they're going to collapse, if they're going to collapse, how they might collapse if various pressures are put onto them. And systems helps enormously in understanding how that can happen, how those things can happen. And for solving all of these policy problems, you have to look 20 years in the future. You have to understand the cycles that American politics goes through. You have to understand the cycles that the demography and the economy are going through right now and how that will change in the future. And just looking behind at our recent and not so recent history and looking forward and taking that into account while you're trying to grasp the systems aspect of this. It's complicated.
Well, it's a good thing we have a podcast to discuss it. Go ahead, right? Jack. Sorry.
Yeah. So can you tell us like a little bit about what you're writing in your book? Like, some of the topics that you're covering, because I am interested to hear, what specifics that you're covering, without giving too much away, obviously.
It would be a good hour or 2 or 3 before I can give away too much.
Well, it's right, so, this conversation is totally free, Morgan. So feel free to divulge whatever you'd like.
Yeah. All right. So basically, what happened once I realized just how much of a thing I'd bitten off with the Interlock project was I said, okay, what's the common factor in all of this? How can I streamline this into something that's not going to be an Encyclopedia Britannica? And one of the recurring issues in all of the research that I've been looking at was poverty. Poverty keeps people from being as productive as they need to be, both for themselves and for the rest of us. And it impacts education, it impacts healthcare, it impacts taxes and the spending that we do from our tax base. It impacts all of the 12 different sections that I was looking at in the Interlock project. And so I said, okay, let's just focus on poverty. Let's focus on how this works.
Well, did you initially start with like a systems diagram? Was this,
Yep.
What were I guess some of the attributes to that systems diagram that about poverty that you may be able to kind of give us some lights on? Is there anything that you anything enlightening that you learned from your diagramming, if you will, that you thought was particularly novel or was interesting?
I mean, that's kind of the thing, though, is the diagramming wasn't novel in and of itself. Like the connections that I was looking at were all in the research base. Everybody knows about these things. The only novel thing is no one had put them all together, as far as I can tell.
So examples. Can you give some examples?
Obviously, we talk about infrastructure being necessary, investing in infrastructure being necessary to keep the economy running. Economic growth impacts the tax base. The more money there is flowing around, the more money the government has to spend on other things. Tax base influences healthcare spending, it influences welfare spending, it influences education spending. All of those 3 impact how well the economy grows, so that's another cycle. All of them impact corruption, criminal justice, which in turn impacts taxes and welfare, which creates another cycle. Environmental issues, pollution, reduces healthcare or reduces health quality, which increases healthcare spending and decreases educational output, educational productivity. You have all of these cycles. So,
and they're degrading.
And this is one of those things where
are we seeing like a degradation?
Yes.
In I guess. I mean, I know that, and maybe we could feel that, but perhaps maybe you are giving it a little bit more hardening as you're kind of stitching all these different negative things together that are happening in the interlock, if you will.
Well,
I mean, I'm assuming that's what it is, right? The interlock is we're stuck.
Yes,
and there's no way to pull apart from
that's the reason for it. It's like a Gordian knot, and there isn't anything that you can pull. We've already solved all of the easy things that there are to solve. The only things left are the incredibly complex things that no one can really... Well, if we do see the solution, too many of us think that it's the wrong solution, and too many of us think that it's only half the solution, or it's too much of a solution, if they can even figure out what the right solution is. The phrase I'm using in the book is wicked problem, something that is simply so complex that no one can figure out how to deal with it, so we have to find a way to cut the knot rather than trying to tease and untangle it incrementally. Again, I just want to reiterate, this is a very visual kind of thing to demonstrate. So if your viewers are interested in seeing the whole spaghetti ball mess, interlockproject.com/the-interlock/.
Well, Morgan,
the article thing is actually illustrated.
So, I actually took a real hard look at your diagram, and we're going to go ahead and put this in the show notes for our audience has it. Essentially, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at all of these different topics in a circle, and I see a series of different colored arrows, which this is systems. And so maybe perhaps it might have been, I know it's extremely complicated, right? And we don't want to just be listing all the different ways this is connected, but maybe we can just talk on this diagram a little bit. One of the things that I did note when it comes to this diagram is, and we were just talking about how pervasive poverty is to the system and how much it has a negative impact. It looks like poverty is, a lot of the arrows are in red, and it's just a red mess on this right-hand side where poverty is affecting, education and demography and health and whatnot. So maybe can you talk a little bit about the this diagram and maybe a little bit about what these colors signify, and maybe that'll give us a view of kind of how the interlock works.
So the colors are there just to make it slightly easier to understand what you're looking at. Basically, when I was first going through this, I realized that I was talking about three basic divisions. There's a physical capital, the stuff that we associate with, roads, bridges, infrastructure, environmental resources, and natural resources. There is human capital, education being the most obvious form, but also the level of health of the population, how many people are in poverty, how many people are being born, dying, the demographic shifts. And then there's social capital, which is the bonds that keep us together and all of the ways that that's sort of falling apart. Plus the economy, which economic growth sort of determines a lot of growth factors and failure factors in the whole mess. So I decided to, instead of giving each domain its own color, which would turn this into a rainbow-hued blob, I said, okay, economy is black because it touches on everything and we need to have that be extra clear. Human capital is going to be red, physical capital is going to be green, and social capital is going to be blue, just to make it slightly easier to see how each sector is affecting the others. As you say, human capital, the red stuff is just this red mess. Everything in human capital impacts itself. Demography impacts how well the education system works. It impacts how many people are in poverty, impacts the healthcare needs and the healthcare productivity of the economy. Education obviously impacts demography, it impacts poverty, it impacts healthcare, both the level of health and how much healthcare is actually needed. Poverty impacts everything again, and the level of health in the population impacts everything else. And that's one of the reasons why I grouped these together, is that the ones that were most tightly clustered were obviously in the physical, human, social capital sections together.
So what I'm seeing, and this is going back to Jack, because I think Jack, you're having a question, how is this true that poverty has this overall negative effect? I mean, I was just trying to figure out what your question was to Morgan about that.
Yeah, so my question was, how did all of this point back to poverty? I mean, what makes it so bad that it has all this negative effect on everything else?
if you look at the poverty bubble and the arrows that are leading off from it, it impacts resource consumption, it impacts corruption, it impacts criminal justice, it impacts taxes and spending. Doesn't have as much of an impact on infrastructure, foreign relations, or the environment, but it impacts everything else. And even those, it can have an impact, depending on how finely combed you're going. Now, it's not the only one that has those kinds of impacts, but it's one of the few that we just are sort of stuck on. Like, no one has good ideas. Most of the rest, we have ideas of how to solve them. We just have to get them through the political process, figure out how to fine-tune them. Poverty, though, we had very few real ways of looking at it that would actually produce a result. Mostly it was just one of the two forms that has already been tried and failed. Either trying to boost the welfare state or to collapse it and force people out to find jobs. There was either or in the political spectrum, and it was the only domain here that needed this approach, in my view, in order to actually produce anything new.
Sure. So I think now this is a perfect opportunity to kind of discuss some. Okay, so if we're going to go ahead and plant the flag, right? We're planting a flag, and we're saying that according to this model, that there's a lot of different levers here to pull. Apparently, a lot of the levers have been pulled in terms of justice or tax and spend, dealing with corruption, the investment in different types of energy and material and infrastructure and all that. But poverty obviously is not something that we've been able to solve. And oh, by the way, according to this model, it seems to be negatively impacting a lot of the things that we do have maybe innovations around. So I guess let's move past this model. Let's talk a little bit about some of the potential solutions. And some of these solutions, I think, Jack, we've been talking about, correct? In some of our podcasts recently. Yeah. So Morgan, I mean, talk to us a little bit about, have you been investigating anything particularly novel when it comes to tackling poverty? Are there any countries or frameworks or devices that are out there that are new or are being imagined?
Yes, I've sort of been both a little gratified and somewhat concerned by the newfound popularity of the universal basic income, because that's at the heart of what I'm proposing in the book. And I'm like, oh God, these people are stealing my thunder. With regards to other countries trying things, one of the leaders in the means of making a UBI work, they're not close to doing a UBI. I'm not even sure they're considering it, but Estonia has it's experimenting with some really remarkable electronic government systems. So personal ID, tax systems, all of that is electronic, highly secure, and phenomenally effective in increasing the efficiency of government. That's really the 1-2 punch that I think needs to happen in order to deal with poverty effectively. You have to eliminate the means tested stuff from the American welfare system, because means testing is part and parcel of the whole Republican issue with welfare. Like, I go into this in the history section of the book. Americans, just by culture and by history, are obsessed with differentiating from the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And that's where means testing comes from. We want to make sure that the people who don't deserve money, government money, don't get it. The money only goes to real charity cases.
Is means testing like the drug testing? Is that what we're talking about? Or I'm just trying to get a view of that.
It's an income test. So okay. if you are earning this much or less and fit these different categories, generally at first it was unwed mothers. Back in the 1930s, woman has a kid and her husband dies, then she suddenly loses all of her income because they weren't working back then. Then she needs government help. That was what part of the New Deal was to make sure that these women weren't put out on the streets if they didn't have family members to support them. And it sort of grew by layers, accretion from that. And so nowadays we have in Texas, you have to be earning paltry sums and be unmarried, female, and have kids in order to get Medicaid. That's means testing. you have to fit different categories and have a maximum income of X in order to get government money from this particular program or that particular program. You have to jump through certain hoops, drug testing being one of them, or spending X amount of time per week looking for a job or going to training programs, whatever. All these things fit under the umbrella of means testing.
So you're proposing to get rid of means testing, and what would that accomplish?
That is, well, okay. So UBI, the Universal Basic Income, the entire idea behind that is, or one of the ideas behind that is, you eliminate the current welfare system, all of the tax breaks, all of the spending programs, and you replace it with a single program that gives every American X amount of dollars per year or per month, depending on how you want to administrate it. And I got my idea from Murray's book, Coming Apart, or In Our Hands, beg your pardon. And he proposed simple $1,000 a month. Every American gets it, and that's barely survivable in modern day economy, but it's survivable. It's not really enough. You have to build other things in, otherwise that alone is not going to cut it, which, like, again, this can go on for hours. I literally have given an hour-and-a-half PowerPoint on this. But you have to build in healthcare safety nets. You have to build in means to ensure that people aren't cheating the government. The point isn't to destroy the safety net. The point is to make it effective. So UBI is a great idea in theory, but it requires a lot of support systems to make it work. Murray's idea is that, just give people money and leave it up to them whether they starve or whether they make use of it. Rather than making them jump through hoops, just make it a very simple system to administer and, increase personal liberty by basically leaving the decision-making up to the individual. Very conservative libertarian approach, even if it's not a very conservative idea. The thing is, you have to have other systems in place. Part of my proposal is that you make the UBI conditional upon people having an insurance policy, so that if they get, so it's just replacing the Obamacare mandate with a conditional mandate for getting access to the UBI. So if you have an insurance plan, then you get, $1,000, $1,200 a month. Okay, that should pay for the insurance plan at the very least, and distribute risk throughout the population, and make it so that everybody has at least enough to survive on. You also have to have systems in place to make sure that people don't take advantage of the system by making multiple accounts for the government to give money to. So you need some sort of secure, unique ID system, which is where the electronic governance systems that Estonia and other countries are experimenting with come in extremely useful.
Sure. So I'm going to give this back to actually Jack, because this is a particular, I'm not going to say it's pain point for Jack, but this is something that I think he's got some good opinions on. Jack, can you talk a little bit about your own issues that you have with UBI? And we've actually even talked about, I don't know if you've seen, but Marina Gorbis, I think that's her name. She's from the Institute for the Future. And she's actually talking even beyond UBI. She's actually talking about UBA, Universal Basic Assets, which are, both physical and then, electronic in the overall society domains, and how we can all use these, similar to like the library systems, the free library systems, where you might have like a tool library in a county or city where you can go and rent out a chop saw or something because you're working at home. But on a global or national scale. But Jack, I know you and I have wrestled a little bit back and forth when it comes to UBI. Do you have any questions for Morgan around your issues you see with UBI systems?
Well, so yeah, like what Chris was saying, Morgan, we talk a lot about UBI. For me, I think it comes down to what, and I tend to be the conservative voice on our on this podcast, and when it comes to UBI, I question whether or not it can be done, because you have to include the human element. I think if everybody was the same, and was caring about the same things, then UBI would be a very good thing going forward. But I look at things like, for example, Georgia is one of the few states in the nation that provides everybody who has a B average, they can go to school for free. They can go to a state school, and it's their tuition is covered to a certain extent for 4 years. Well, the problem with that is that everybody uses that, even the people who are more than able to afford the cost of tuition. From the poorest person to the richest person in Georgia, they all are able to do that. And what that does is that allows, what I think, if you give everybody that money, then it would just raise the price of everything else. If you include that in the economy, then won't that just increase the amount that people have, and then prices will increase? I mean, you tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, that is a thing that's going to happen if you institute a UBI. The thing about that is that kind of price inflation has brakes on it. There are limits to how far people can push that. And at bare bones, it is going to happen, but it's not going to be as bad as an out-of-control inflationary spiral. Now, there are sectors where low-income people are just going to get shafted if there aren't controls put in place, housing being one of them. But that's part of the reason, part of why I'm turning this into a book that isn't just about the UBI, it's about everything else, because you have to have other systems in place to make a UBI work, like I said.
And these are the government efficiency systems that you're giving voice to?
Efficiency systems, but also ways of distributing tax dollars between... one of the... this doesn't actually address your point about private sector prices, because that is one of the things that I think... Keep in mind that this is... My opinion is that of a systems expert and political science and policy analyst person, not an economist. My understanding is that the inflation would be sharp, but not very large if you increased everybody's income by this amount. And it would be something that would be manageable by most of the population. But there have to be other things to make the rest of it work. And one of those things is a way of distributing money to local governments where the tax base simply isn't high enough. So that they can afford public services. Sorry, getting away from your question there.
I think enforcement is another part of my concern is, we have, for example, Social Security. Well, I used to work for a company that worked with Social Security benefits, and the Social Security Administration was so overwhelmed that they, weren't able to always follow up with people on Social Security, and there were people on it who weren't supposed to be on it. There were people on it who weren't getting it. So, the idea of, a big government, again, this is conservative in me saying, we're going to give everyone this, but, are we going to check every year, every month to see if everyone falls within this poverty line? When you're talking about giving away money to people, I think I like the idea. I'm just concerned that it won't solve the problem, but instead just create more problems instead.
Oh, yeah. Basic tenet of systems thinking, every solution creates a new problem. So, yes, but the idea... And again, this goes back to the electronic governance systems. You have to have, before any of this goes into effect, there has to be a way of ensuring that, all right, let me just break this down on a mechanical level. Every person in the US has a secure bank account secured by biometric security measures, personal password, fingerprint, iris scan, whatever. This is administered by a local bank. Not by the government, so that the government doesn't have everybody's biometrics. They can issue a warrant for it to the bank, but that's on the government, and that's on a per request basis. So the bank has control of the account like you would have if you had a Chase account today, but it's secure, unique to a single person, and there's a clearinghouse to make sure that a single person's biometrics don't show up in the system multiple times. So the government has a list of these bank account numbers, one for every American, and sends the check to those bank account numbers. If there are more accounts than there are Americans, something's up and they go into inspector mode. They compare the biometrics of the various accounts. They ensure that all these people are actually citizens, which is part of the system that the banks are in charge of, requiring everybody to come in, refresh their biometrics, assure the bank that they aren't dead every 6 months. And
could also, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Morgan, but could also maybe blockchain technology and its hyper ledger, also do us a good favor here by
that's mandatory. Otherwise, you have hackers getting into the system and basically fleecing everybody in the system of their money. So it has to be secure. It doesn't work if it isn't secure. And it doesn't work politically if the government can't say there is no way to break this without a supercomputer and a couple centuries.
Sure. I'm really trying to drill down to Jack here. And by the way, I love you, Jack. I don't even think you're a contrarian here. I think what Morgan, what you're proposing here is not only particularly novel. People are talking about it, but I think they're talking about it on the edges, right? Elon Musk will talk about it in a long talk that he has in a conference somewhere for an hour. He may talk about it for 2-3 minutes, and it gets all this adulation, like, hey, Elon Musk is all about the universal basic income. But unfortunately, he's not doing the depth of work that you're doing. So I think you're definitely on the avant-garde and the vanguard, and like you pursuing Charles Murray's work is novel, and we need thinkers like you. But also, I think we need contrarians like Jack to put many holes into your idea as possible. So I'm trying to give as much of these holes as much oxygen as they can. So is there anything else besides the cost? I guess maybe it's the incentive, right? We always hear about the lack of incentive. If you just give people money, it doesn't incentivize them to do anything. They'll just sit there and sit back. And if you give somebody $1,000, they'll find a way to just use that $1,000 and not go and try to get excess capital through work. And of course, this is through those people, the means testing. I don't know if there will be a means testing where we're going to double check to see if people are doing anything with that $1,000. So I mean, I agree with you, Jack. I think this needs to be thought about. I'm just wondering if you have anything else that you think are particularly harmful and would be negative when it comes to the introduction of a UBI, and maybe kind of you and Morgan can hash it out for the next 5 minutes.
Well, I see a lot of issues with them just because obviously when you're a person, you can only speak from your own personal experiences or from the experiences of others. And from what I've seen, about the welfare and things like that, it does. And I'm not disagreeing with you, Morgan and Chris, that this could potentially help a lot of people. And maybe that's the answer to this is, where welfare has failed in several regards. This, with the advent of technology and, computer overlords, they'll be able to see and be able to regulate this better than human beings can. But, I think it has to be something where it can show that it is going to make the difference. Instead of people just giving people free money, like when you were giving people food stamps and they were selling them to buy TVs, like this has to be something where they can go in and you can say, look, this is purchasing basic needs like, roof over your house, over yourself and food.
Yeah. And my response to that is that it doesn't mean that states can't have a part in regulating how people spend it. It's just that baseline, people get it and they can spend it on what they want. If they end up homeless because of their own decisions, then states have the right, not the federal government, but states have the right to decide, okay, what are we going to do with this population? They're getting income, but they're wasting it on things that are keeping them unproductive and poor. And so they may institute controlled spending programs, basically. Okay, so this chunk of your UBI, this chunk of your citizens tax credit is what I call it in the book, goes to housing. Here, this is your apartment for the next 3-6 months, and we'll see what happens to you after that. Or whatever. It's up to the states, and that's the way I think it needs to be. Otherwise, you end up with the federal government deciding how things work in Kansas and New York City. Not going to work. And yes, the fact that there are people who simply wouldn't be able to make the right decisions there means that there are going to be issues. There are going to be people out on the street, even if they're getting enough to theoretically put a roof over their head. And that's where government needs to come in again. The problem is with the current system, we have us and them rather than based on those people are getting money and we're not, and they're wasting it, so they're evil. With a UBI, it's everybody's getting money. Some people don't have either the ability or the opportunity to spend it correctly, quote unquote. God, there's so much judgment in this whole thing, which is why I try to avoid it. I try to turn it into a system where the governments get to make the decisions that help the most people.
Well, and I can ask you a question right there. I mean, a theological question is everybody redeemable? Is everybody who can get the $1,000, are they redeemable people? Is everyone capable of redemption?
Probably not, but does it matter?
Well, if you're going to give them $1,000, and they're going to, a month, and they're going to spend it, and it's, maybe buy drugs and maybe harm the society in itself, not just harm themselves, but harm society. Is that something that is, that is still a worthwhile cause?
Yes, because if they do that, then we do what we do with people who harm society anyway. We put them under government-controlled management. Right now, we call that prison. And we throw a lot of people in it for being homeless, being unable to manage whatever mental health issues they have, having drug addiction, whatever. Under a UBI system, that is a tiny home with government healthcare workers checking in on you every week or so, making sure that you're taking your meds, making sure that you're okay, checking to see how you've been doing on job applications, helping you with job integration programs, whatever, but being paid for by your UBI. And it's a way of financing that kind of thing without destroying someone's personal liberty. It puts an intermediary step in between complete freedom and going to prison.
One thing I see here, Morgan, when it comes to this introduction of this UBI platform or program, obviously we're talking about the only way in order to institute this is through the efficiencies of smarter government. And by the way, yes, there's a lot of technologies that are just coming online as of right now, and this may help steward UBI effectively or as effectively as possible. However, the human mechanisms are still going to need to be there, which means that you will have a growth of government, right? And that is seen as something that is negative. And I think Jack would probably attest to this, perhaps, that the growth of government. So you may have some efficiencies created, perhaps in the distribution of UBI, but if you need to have it properly instituted, you're alluding to there needs to be sort of humanistic mechanisms where you're going to have people on the ground to ensure that people are not only using it properly, but their communities are being taken care of and whatnot. And this is actually one of the prime negative aspects, right, of people people don't want big government, right? That's the ultimate cross to bear when it comes to the current battle between conservatives and progressives, right? I want government out of my life versus I think government is a catalyst for change and efficiency, and I might want a little bit more of it. So have you kind of tackled a little bit the difference between those two competing paradigms, and does your model has it effectively tried to address this at all?
Not to the satisfaction of everybody, but yes, I think so. The question of big government is government over-regulation or government spending. Like that gets blurred in American politics a little too much. Spending is definitely a thing. Like this doubles, or I'm not actually sure exactly what increase it is. I'd have to refresh myself on the numbers. It's a significant increase in the outlay of money to the American public over the current welfare system. I would argue that it's a significantly more efficient outlay, and that the regulation that you're talking about, the people on the ground who make sure that homeless have a place to live, drug addicts get treatment, that is what the current system already does, but the new system would slightly expand it and give it the proper funding to actually do its job rather than trying to put Band-Aids on gushing wounds. which, I mean, you go to any social services department in any municipality or state government, and they will tell you they do not have enough funding to do their job properly, and so they're left patching up holes rather than doing preventive medicine and trying to solve the problem before it gets to a crisis point. So it is a big government, but at the same time, it's better government from my analysis of how it would actually have an impact. Obviously, that's up for debate, and that's one of the reasons why I'm putting the book out there, because, all right, going back to the Interlock project, this whole thing is just a part of the entire point of the book. The book is being written because I want people to look at it as an entire interlocking mess. I want people to look at the problem as a whole, not one small part of it, no matter how massive that small part is, like healthcare, like poverty, whatever. So the solution is my idea. The problem, though, needs to be addressed no matter how we solve it. Sorry, personal rant. The issue of big government is, I think, a question of how deep do you want government to go into your life? And with the UBI, really that it lessens the impact on the majority of Americans. They get a government check in their a secure bank account every month, and their taxes are deducted from their paycheck, and that's it. They don't have to do taxes in April unless they are obscenely rich. And if they can't administer their own finances properly, then government may be forced to step in. Maybe, depending on state, again, not on the federal level. And so that would be up to the states to decide, which is partly a sop to the conservative federalist movement, but partly an efficiency movement because, like I said, administering a program in Kansas is not the same as administering it in New York City or Boston.
Sure. Well, I mean, what I got to say is, Morgan, is I got to put my hat out to you just because, tackling the major crises of the entire United States of America as a one-man show, not only through a systems perspective, but also ideating on how UBI could be, implemented as judiciously as you can, and trying to thread that needle between the progressives and the conservative side of the house. This is no easy feat, man. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the work that you have coming in the next couple of years. Are you working on anything in the next couple months or year or so? You have any idea when the book might be done, or how much more work you want to put into it?
Oh, the book has been pushed back repeatedly over the last couple of years because I always thought that I was so close to finishing it. Currently, I'm expecting it to be out summer or fall of 2018, but that's a fingers crossed estimate. If you guys want to have a more detailed look at the tax system and the UBI idea proposal, I have it up on my personal blog, deepsystems.wordpress.com. And you can go through, poke as many holes in it as you want. I would appreciate it, actually. Get some debate going on this idea, and I can incorporate worthy changes into it in the final product.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's something that we're thinking about, and we may have a podcast in the future where we get folks like yourself on the UBI, front versus folks against, and we'll do some sort of intelligent square debate. I think it'd be fun.
Awesome. I'd love to.
Cool, man. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Morgan, for joining us. Really appreciate it. You did great. And yeah, great to hear you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yep. Have a great one.
You too.
Right, you too.